Okay, I'm going to turn things over now to Jay Laboff, who's one of our members of our committee, our organizing committee, and he's going to introduce the speaker for today. Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you, Charlie. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Barbara N. Horowitz. Barbara's a cardiologist and psychiatrist on the faculties of Harvard Medical School, Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, and the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. She is the co-director of the Evolutionary Medicine program at UCLA, and she also currently serves as the president of ISEMPH. Barb is the New York Times best-selling co-author of Zobiquity, The Astonishing Connection Between Human and Animal Health. In her research, she uses systematic reviews, bioinformatics, and phylogenetics to integrate scholarship from the fields of evolutionary biology, ecology, and human pathophysiology. Since 2011, Barbara has also organized a series of international Zobiquity conferences with the goal of, quote, accelerating biomedical innovation through collaboration between leaders in human and animal medicine, unquote. The most recent conference for Zobiquity was hosted by the Karolinska Institute on Cardiovascular Diseases and Infertility. The next conference was to be scheduled for November 2020 in Tokyo, but will be delayed, and Barbara may be able to provide some additional information later. Her latest book, Wildhood, The Epic Journey from Adolescence to Adulthood in Human and Other Animals, co-written with Catherine Bowers, examines the transition to independence across species to better understand the challenges faced by humans in this important phase of life. You can get more information about all of her work at zobiquity.com, and I would strongly recommend that you read her books. I've read both of them, and they were transformative for me. So it is my great pleasure to present to you Barbara Horowitz. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay and Charlie and Meredith and everyone from Club EvMed. You guys are doing an amazing job. And I have to say, from ISEMPH's perspective, this has just been a wonderful way to just expand our audience and the EvMed community. So thank you. So I'm going to jump in and here we go. All right. All right, everybody seeing okay? We've got, yes, we got a thumbs up. All right, so this is an adolescent king penguin on South George Island in 2005. And Catherine and I, while we were researching the book, we were following wild animal adolescents around the globe who were being tracked either using GPS or radio collar. And one of the individuals we followed was an adolescent king penguin. So just wanted to start with that. This is one of my favorite videos. I have a lot of wildlife video, a lot of adolescent animal video, but this transitioning penguin who is partially, still has some of the brown juvenile down, and but the white adult plumage is peeking out underneath is just absolutely one of my favorite. All right. So everybody on this call today would agree that nothing in biology makes sense outside the light of evolution. And if that's the case, then certainly nothing in neurobiology makes sense outside the light of evolution. And given what we know about life and biology, we can also say, well, nothing in endocrinology makes sense outside of the light of evolution. Now, for those of us who've had teenagers or been teenagers, we know that neurobiology and endocrinology play a big role in adolescence. And so I think we can safely say that nothing in adolescence makes sense outside the light of evolution. And so today I'm going to make the case that by looking across species and evolutionary time, we can first better increase our understanding of the nature of adolescent vulnerability. That is, why adolescents are so vulnerable to accidents and injuries and death. The mortality rate between the ages of 12 and 19 increases 5-fold. Why adolescents are so vulnerable to mental illness. If we define adolescence, as many of the neurobiologists do, as extending through the 20s while the brain is still developing, 3/4 of all mental illness will begin before or during adolescence. And finally, why adolescents are so vulnerable to various forms of exploitation. Number 2, by looking across species in evolutionary time, we can begin using a tool that transformed the field of medicine from an experience-based field to an evidence-based field. We can use that tool and bring it into the field of evolutionary medicine to better understand the nature of a range of vulnerabilities. And 3, shine the light of evolutionary medicine across specialties. That is, begin looking, for example, at pediatrics, in which adolescent medicine is considered part of pediatrics, or adolescent psychiatry, or even addiction medicine. At the very least, by looking across species in evolutionary time and beginning to think in this evolutionary context about adolescence, we can offer pediatricians and psychiatrists and a range of experts who care for young people who are in this transition to independence, some idea about the advantages of moving beyond proximate explanations to non-proximate explanations. And in other words, to really introduce this idea that an explanation that's descriptive is not really an explanation. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. Now, that's a big program if I'm gonna make the case that all those 3 things can be accomplished by this approach. But I don't want to talk all morning and I want to have time for Q&A. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about adolescence in an evolutionary context. I'll go on to share with you very briefly a methodology that I've developed to bring the tools of systematic review and evidence-based medicine into the field of evolutionary medicine, particularly with a broad comparative lens. I'm going to then go ahead and give you an example of how this methodology can be used to better understand vulnerability to a cardiovascular disorder that occurs in adolescence. Now, adolescents are physically generally very healthy and they don't have a lot of heart disease, but there are a couple of disorders which we do see in younger individuals and adolescents in particular. And then, time permitting, I'll just very briefly share a few examples of how this approach can be used to better understand vulnerability to accidents and injuries, mental illness, and exploitation. Well, adolescence, when you ask people today, well, what do they think about it, right, adults? You'll get a range of answers. If you're talking to physicians and you ask, why is adolescence such a vulnerable period? They're going to probably give you a neurobiological explanation. But in general, the thing that I hear most when I ask a question about what people think is a kind of hand-wringing response. And this young man, go to your room and stay there until your prefrontal cortex develops, speaks to that kind of the pathologizing of adolescence and the kind of medicalization of adolescence as being caused by this underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, that's at the root of the problem. Well, it turns out whether you are talking about Mark Twain or Shakespeare, there's a lot of hand-wringing about adolescence over the course of history. And you can see it dating back to Aristotle, who wrote, "I see no hope for our future if we depend on the frivolous youth of today. They are reckless beyond word." But if we want to really focus on the evolutionary framing of adolescence, we have to fast forward to the 19th century. And Haeckel's, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was quickly embraced. And it's the theoretical framework that, like a piece of gum on the bottom of someone's shoe, you just see continuing generation after generation in terms of this thinking about adolescence. So G. Stanley Hall, for example, who's credited with being the father of the modern field of adolescence, and of course, one of the pioneers of American psychology, and by the way, an odious eugenicist and racist, But he was the person who brought this term Sturmendrang, the storms and stresses of adolescence, into the common parlance. And he believed that adolescence was a time in which an individual was recapitulated form of the savage stage. And Freud really adopted this recapitulation model for adolescence, viewing adolescence as kind of an atavistic state of development. His daughter, the psychoanalyst Anna Freud, although she did write a whole book called The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense about adolescent defense mechanisms, also embraced this idea that adolescence was a period of sort of an uncookedness, a kind of primitive state. It was a pathologized view of adolescence. And embedded within that are really the roots of adultocentrism, which is an issue and a problem actually in modern biology. But the person that I really want to focus on today is Margaret Mead, because Margaret Mead founded the field of comparative adolescence. And her PhD advisor, her professor, Franz Boas, the anthropologist at Columbia, he too was concerned about adolescence, the problem of adolescence, the problem of the adolescence in the 1920s. And so he sent Margaret Mead to the island of Tua in Samoa at the tender age of 23, which by the definition of modern neurobiologists would be adolescence, to answer the question, are the disturbances which vex our adolescence due to the nature of adolescence itself or to the civilization? So a nature-nurture framework. Well, Margaret Mead, there's a lot that we can say about her. I have enjoyed sort of tracing her story and some of the controversies, but no one can deny that she launched this comparative view of adolescence. And of course, Coming of Age in Samoa was really a seminal book in modern anthropology. And although Margaret Mead was looking across human cultures comparatively, it has really been a source of inspiration for Catherine Bowers and myself in thinking about adolescence across species. And in fact, in the course that we teach at Harvard, Coming of Age on Planet Earth, we take the students through the Museum of Comparative Zoology over to the anthropology library, the Tazra Library, and we spend the first day with first edition of Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. But my interest really was not in looking across human cultures. It really has been looking across species broadly to identify continuities, patterns that perhaps have been missed by a narrower framework in thinking about comparative opportunities. And so the first question that I had to ask in thinking about comparative adolescence was, do non-human animals have an adolescence? And I had reason to be concerned about this question because very quickly I found a number of studies that seemed to suggest that adolescence was created by our modern human times, or perhaps was uniquely human. And this Ancestors Skip Adolescence is a report about a study. And let me just summarize this issue by saying that the physical anthropologists who identified differences in bone growth in Homo sapiens versus Homo erectus or other hominid antecedents were very accurate in how they described this, but the press, the sort of reporting on the findings, sort of summarized things, and in doing so mischaracterized their findings. And so the first sentence of this, our early ancestors never went through the awkward age. Of course, they're talking about hominids, but that implies that adolescence emerged with our species. And that isn't the case. And there's a really wonderful story that can be told about the echo chamber effect and how an idea can be distorted and propagated. In fact, there is a significant literature about non-human animal adolescents. And one of the things that you have to do, and I do in my work, is to begin looking at nomenclature and definitions, because sometimes when you're looking across fields and certainly across species, there are different terms that mean very much the same thing. So for example, there are decades of research on fledgling birds, on smolting salmon, on yearling deer and other ungulates, on subadult humpback whales and a range of other animals, dispersing mammals, dispersing animals. And my favorite of all terms for adolescent animal is the term elver, which means is an adolescent eel. And so without a doubt, adolescence is certainly not uniquely human. But what do we mean by adolescence? And the answer, for the purposes of our project, Catherine and I, this research project that we embarked on that took 5 years, studying adolescence across, around the world, and field observations, doing systematic reviews, teaching our courses, is that adolescence, an adolescent animal, has entered puberty, but has not yet become a mature adult. And the definition of mature adult is an individual who has developed competencies that allow it to deal with the vulnerabilities of this phase of life. And so, while the course starts at the Anthropology Museum, much of the course and our work involves looking comparatively across species at adolescent animals. Well, Zubiquity was the first book that Catherine and I wrote together, and for Zubiquity, we asked a question: do non-human animals have heart disease and cancer and mental illness? And it seems almost silly now to ask those questions, but at the time, this was already almost 15 years ago that we were asking these questions. There was it was not clear. It was a lot of talk about human uniqueness. And over the course of years and developing strategies for understanding the significance of non-human animal medical illness, I began thinking about how we could look at vulnerability to disease from an evolutionary context and developing phylogenies. By the way, these are not yet published, so please don't tweet or send these anywhere. To very briefly tell you what the methodology that I've used is essentially using systematic review methods which integrate studies, and using these to integrate studies on different species. So what is a systematic review? So a systematic review is a very specific form of information gathering that allows for a comprehensive and specific question-focused retrieval of information, a synthesis, and a meta-analysis. Before systematic reviews were possible, and systematic reviews emerged in the context of search engines and the internet, so it wasn't until 1991 or so that we began seeing the power of systematic reviews, medical decision-making was made on the basis of individual experience, a seasoned master clinician's lifetime of experience of reading, of knowledge. But with systematic review, we could go from an individual's experience to aggregating experience and sorting it and answering questions in a way that was much, much more powerful. And so what I realized I wanted to do was to look broadly across species for to capture insights about vulnerabilities to a range of disorders, and then find a way to organize them and ask questions about them that would create a kind of analysis that would be relevant from an evolutionary perspective. And that was ultimately creating phylogenies, using life history to understand the patterns that emerged on these phylogenetic models. And systematic reviews, as I do them, I really look at the animal literature quite a lot and follow the formal methods of systematic review. But ultimately, my goal has been to look across fields, the literature, and species to identify patterns, trends, and connections. Now, when it comes to adolescence, the question that was important to me was, are there commonalities between individual animals who are phylogenetically perhaps very disparate, simply on the basis of being in the same developmental phase of life? And the answer to that question, I feel quite confident in reporting, is yes, there are. And that in fact, if we have too much of a Homo sapiens-centric view, or even a hominid-centric view, or even a mammalian-centric view, if the aperture through which we're trying to perceive these developmental characteristics is too narrow, we miss important patterns, trends, and connections. And that is essentially the approach that we used for this latest book, Childhood. So I now want to share with you how we can use this methodology to understand a cardiovascular vulnerability of adolescence, something called vasovagal syncope, which means essentially it's fear, it's what people think of as fear fainting. So adolescents are healthy, right? They don't have a lot of heart disease, but fainting is not uncommon. About 1 in 7 adolescents will have one of these fear-triggered fainting episodes, and it happens sometimes when blood's being drawn, and people have them as they, exit adolescence and into adulthood, but people often grow out of these. And age 13 is the most common age for which this presents. Now, in my former life as a professor of cardiology at UCLA, I took care of a lot of patients with syncope, and I taught the pathophysiology course to med students. And I taught them that the problem of this fear-triggered fainting was a paradoxical response to fear. Why paradoxical? Well, one would anticipate that the fear of needles or something else, would trigger an accelerated heart rate, a fight-flight response, sympathetic overdrive. But that, in fact, what happens with fear-triggered fainting is the opposite, that fear triggers what's called bradycardia, a slowing of the heart. And with that bradycardia, the heart, which should be pumping blood, this is oxygenated blood, up into the aorta and the brain, slows down. Not enough blood enters the brain on both hemispheres, and that leads to fainting. Now, how can we use this methodology to better understand the nature of adolescent vulnerability Well, the first question that I ask is, well, what other species exhibit what's called alarm bradycardia, fear bradycardia? And I won't take you through this too much, but, and this is not the actual phylogeny, but this is an example of a taxonomy of species that I create from these systematic reviews that I then just place on a pre-existing phylogeny using ITOL, something as simple and just as water as that. The purpose of this exercise is to look at this phylogeny to see how widespread a characteristic is or isn't, and then begin to closely look at life history characteristics of these species and ask questions about the adaptive nature of the characteristic. Well, it's certainly, not hard to think of an adaptive benefit of an accelerated heart rate in response to fear, right? That's what we would all anticipate, get away from danger. But what on earth could be the adaptive benefit of a slow heart rate? Well, this is a fawn, a young deer, and studies that have been done on young animals where they put EKG telemetry leads on them and then they play scary noises like recordings of wolf howls, show an abrupt deceleration of heart rate. And in fact, this physical response, which is an example of tonic immobility. And it turns out that tonic immobility is seen across species, across chordates and beyond, but let's focus only on chordates. And in fact, it is very adaptive as an anti-predation strategy. How can I prove that? Well, there are, I'm not going to prove it to you in this call, but I'm going to quickly show you a wonderful video that illustrates how, in this case, it certainly was survival enhancing. In the moments prior to this clip, There was a young cheetah who had hunted down this impala, but then was intimidated away by a mature hyena. And you'll see what happens, and keep your eye on the impala, not on the hyena. So the hyena's digging in, time to eat. Uh-oh, the cheetah's back. Chased off, keep your eye on the impala. Right, so clearly, tonic immobility, whether induced by alarm bradycardia or another mechanism, was fitness enhancing. And we see tonic immobility used across the animal kingdom. This is a juvenile mongoose, and just love this. And the point is that we see it more in younger animals than in older animals. In fact, it appears to be, in my opinion, I think at least we see in a number of species where there's evidence, it is an adaptive strategy for younger animals for whom a fight-flight response, a tachycardia, might not yet be effective. So it's a hiding response, a kind of crypsis versus flight, a developmentally entrained response. All right, how can this approach be used to understand adolescent vulnerability to, let's say, accidental injury and death? And this is a very, very significant issue. I have to say that I wasn't really sufficiently aware of how dangerous this phase of life is. You know, we know that this is a CDC chart from a few years ago, but the statistics haven't changed much. If you look at males versus females, there's some difference, but this is the age of 12, this is the age of 19, this is the death rate per 100,000 population. You see this really significant trend. Now, how does that make sense? Well, we're going to talk about that. Well, one of the things that we know is that adolescents do take risks. And why that is a question that I pose to my students. And when I pose the question to my students, who are, you know, knowledgeable and living in the world, and frankly, themselves adolescents, right? They are like 18 to 22. They will tell me that it's their teenage brains. They have kind of been indoctrinated that there's this problem with the teenage brain. And there are many characteristics of the teenage brain, but this is kind of the cartoon version of it, that the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped. And if you think of the PFC as sort of the governor, the container, the controller, the inhibitor of impulses that are emerging from limbic structures, that by the time an individual is a mature adult, the PFC has come online and is acting like a real effective governor, but during adolescence, it's underdeveloped. So this is sort of the model. Well, I talk with groups of physicians and pediatricians, and I've been talking a lot about comparative adolescence recently. And when I ask them to explain impulsivity and risk-taking in adolescence, the explanation that I invariably get is something along these lines. And what I gently begin to point out is that while this is an explanation of sorts, it really is a description of a reductive process. That an explanation in the most, in the fullest sense, requires an evolutionary context. And that is really, I think, an insight that is missing from the field of medicine, from, I think, every field of medicine. And it's a real opportunity for us to begin thinking that way, to be moving toward a more species-spanning and less anthropocentric point of view. So what did I do? Well, for this particular book, Catherine and I started by asking similar questions that we had asked for Ubiquity, for our chapters in Ubiquity. And we started by asking, well, if the explanation for the high mortality in human adolescents is the human brain, is it the underdeveloped PFC, then how is, should we then not see increased mortality in other adolescents? In other words, are we going to see increased mortality during this phase of life? And we did a full systematic review. And to make a long story short, there is no question that across chordates, we see increased mortality in fledging birds, dispersing mammals. And there are a range of reasons for that, some of which are, I think, really illuminating for thinking about danger in human adolescence beyond a kind of reductive neurobiological explanation, which of course is descriptive in the absence of an evolutionary context. Well, the proximate explanations that are often given for increased risk-taking, let's say, and the dangerous phase of life is that adolescent animals and the characteristics that I have listed here, all four, have been identified in the lab in adolescent mice, in adolescent fish, in adolescent birds. Linda Spear's work, Lauren Steinberg, there are a range of people who are really looking at certain characteristics, fundamental characteristics of adolescence. So adolescent animals, broadly defined, underestimate risk, have increased interest in novelty, have a preference for peer-directed socialization, and increased pleasure reward. So let's begin to look at life history and look for adaptive explanations. Well, let's start with underestimating risk. So adolescent animals do underestimate risk. We did a study, we looked at the large roadkill studies, and we were able to correlate the species most likely to be roadkilled with their season of dispersal. This is actually an adolescent whale. This is an adolescent whale in Ventura County and a couple of years ago that got lost. And whale strikes are actually more common in adolescent animals. But when adolescent wildlife are more likely to get lost, probably related to this underestimation of risk, interest, and novelty, and just inexperience. There's this, this is a hyena who's demonstrating interest in novelty, someone who has their window down, and increased peer-directed socialization. All right. Well, what are the consequences of these characteristics? Well, the consequences of inexperience, of underestimating risk, of having increased interest in new things and an increased reward in exploring those things, is that adolescent animals are easy prey. The term that I first encountered in Tim Caro's wonderful book, Defenses in Mammals and Birds, Anti-Predator Defenses in Animals and Birds, is predator naivete. And I have many examples of this in the book, but there are quite a wide range of species, of predatory species that specialize on animals who have just left the nest or just left the burrow. In other words, they are they're big enough to be outside of direct parental supervision, care, protection, but they lack experience. They are gullible. This is one of my favorite examples. This particular ecotype of orca specializes on subadults. Subadults is one of the terms that it means adolescent by the criteria that we use. And you can see that a vast majority of the humpback whales that the orcas were preying on in this particular study were subadults and occasional calf. Now, these characteristics that are, create vulnerability then facilitate a kind of adaptive learning. And there's a broader story that we tell in the book about how how learning is shaped by these vulnerabilities. But I want to just tell you about one example of a form of adaptive learning, a strategy that is seen in adolescent animals from, in some invertebrates, but let's just start with from fish, amphibian, reptiles, birds, and mammals, and it's called predator inspection. Predator inspection is a behavior that is overlapping with mobbing behavior. That is when groups of individual animals come together to deal with a danger using their kind of safety in numbers. But predator inspection, we're going to look first at this adolescent meerkat, is an activity where individuals come together and move toward instead of away from predators. This meerkat's moving toward a Cape cobra. We'll be joined by conspecifics. This is a mixed age group, which you see, but it appears that the threshold for risk-taking decreases when there are more individuals together. And we know in human adolescents that the threshold for risk-taking decreases when there are other adolescents nearby. That's one of the reasons why when your kid starts to drive, they're not allowed to drive with peers in the car for a while. So it's interesting to begin asking whether that phenomenon, which is highly consequential in human life, could be related to predator inspection physiology, which is so widespread. In the video on your right, these are Thompson gazelle, and I don't know if you saw this adolescent move toward these cheetahs, and they're standing and watching cheetahs here until they've had enough. But this is an example of predator inspection. And a wonderful study on predator inspection that was done by Claire Fitzgibbon many years ago showed that adolescent Thompson gazelle that approached predators while they had a high mortality, by the time they were adults, their mortality, their risk had plummeted, suggesting that, well, this vulnerability to danger, which precipitates this behavior that is itself dangerous, is necessary to facilitate the kind of adaptive learning that in the long run is fitness enhancing through survival. That's predator inspection. Well, it's 8:42 and I'm gonna kind of keep moving along, but let me briefly give you some examples of how we can begin to use this framework of thinking about vulnerability as the characteristic that can help us understand some aspects of human adolescence that you might not think there would be any animal perspective to consider. So let's talk about exploitation. There are several forms of exploitation that we discuss in the book. One form of exploitation that is interesting, I won't spend too much time on here, has to do with, you know, adolescence as being low in status hierarchies, particularly if there is a linear status hierarchy. Age and size are part of these kind of collection of prior attributes that are very much at play in the formation of a linear hierarchy. And so simply by being an adolescent, by being a sub-adult, that prior attribute means that there's going to be, that adolescents are going to have lower status. And that has significant consequences, for example, in flocks of birds where there's food, where dominants restrict access to food so that subordinates are hungrier. And hungrier animals have to take risks that the dominant, well-fed, less hungry animals don't. And so there are some really fascinating ways to begin looking at those animal studies and thinking about a very disturbing study that the Urban Institute published about 5 years ago, looking at food insecurity in human adolescents in the United States. And the significant issue of adolescents engaging in risky activity simply to eat, and risky activity, whether it's sexual activity, gang activity, drug transactions. And this is risk-taking behavior that is not being caused by the abnormal prefrontal cortex. It is a consequence of a lack of resource, low resource holding potential. And we see something similar when we look at subordinate fish, subordinate birds, etc. There are several other interesting connections I'll briefly touch on, and then we'll open it up for questions. I think everyone on this call is probably aware that we're seeing earlier puberty in many populations around the world, certainly here in the United States. And we know that overnutrition is a significant factor, and that the consequences of early puberty are medical. We know that it an earlier cycle increases risks for certain cancers and some other issues. But it turns out early puberty is also a risk factor for molestation, for certain forms of sexual abuse in girls. And we are looking at some girls in the US who are having puberty, reaching puberty, having their first menstrual cycles in 2nd and 3rd grade. Well, these are not adolescents. These are children who are having their period. And unfortunately, the kind of adultification which affects some groups in this country more than others, it can be catastrophic. And so we see this phenomenon. Well, one really interesting connection that we found, it was a study that looked at the lemur, the ring-tailed lemur on St. Catherine Island off the coast of Georgia. And of course, the lemur who live in Madagascar have to work hard for their food, and they are leaner. And they typically go into, they reach sexual maturity at about 2 to 2.5 years of age. And by that point, they've acquired the suite of behaviors that allow them to project dominance. And ring-tailed lemur are a female dominant species. And with that dominance, they really, there is not significant amounts of sexual coercion of females by males, something that's seen in many other species, not just primates. But what's happening, at least in the cases that were reported on St. Catherine Island, is that with human provisioning, the lemur were reaching puberty, reproductive maturity at about 1 year of age, but they had not yet developed the suite of behaviors to express social dominance. And so early puberty seemed to be contributing to the first reports of sexual coercion in this otherwise female dominant species. So this is you know, there's no way to do a systematic review of a report here or there, and yet I think it's interesting to at least shine light on a comparative perspective on what is at a minimum an endocrinologically linked phenomenon of body mass index and overnutrition accelerating the onset of reproductive maturity. A sort of similar vulnerability, there are a number of reports of it, I'll just share one, and then I think I'll stop. Has to do with being young and being vulnerable to sexual coercion. So the California sea otter, this is off the coast of Monterey, there was lots and lots of studies about them, but there's a very disturbing study that was published, Tim Tinker, in 2010, where they looked at interspecific sexual coercion and actually, in many cases, death by these sea otter on juvenile Pacific harbor seals. So it was interspecific. And so it's an example of sexual coercion that has nothing to do with interspecific sexual coercion, but that the individuals were all, I hope you can see my mouse pointer, W is weaning, so this is sort of early adolescence, right? The transition to independence is beginning with weaning. You see that the age, there's an occasional pup, but that in general younger, whether pups or weaning or subadults, SA is subadults, were targeted. And so this again reinforces this kind of idea that being younger, having fewer resources, having fewer alliances, having less information is a vulnerability. And we know that this is something that is a topic of conversation on campuses. Freshmen are targeted more than, there's something called the red zone, many of you probably know about. But this issue of experience, this issue of being targeted, of being easy prey, etc. Again, we want to be cautious on how we look at these. Obviously, this is interspecific, and this is something that is, we don't want to make too much of a, kind of a comparison about. And yet, again, I think these kinds of interspecific comparisons can be very useful. And finally, I touched on this before in terms of vulnerability of being a subordinate, but this is an example. For decades there has been a literature looking at hiding behavior and hunger dependency. And one interesting form of exploitation, and I would call it that, by dominant, certain species of dominant birds on subordinates, is that when a predator emerges, the birds flee to the bushes to hide. The first birds out are the hungriest birds, who tend to be subordinates, who are based again on this prior attribute hypothesis, are going to be younger. And of course, why is this exploitive? Well, if the predator is still there, the first out are the ones who are going to be eaten. And that is very advantageous, obviously, to dominance. So it's, there are lots of ways of looking at it. Finally, a tiny little bit about mental illness. There is so much that I've been thinking about looking broadly and comparatively at mental illness. A couple of insights. We know that adverse early childhood experiences in human life increases the likelihood of psychopathology in later life. The ACEs are increasingly are the model that we're using to really look at public health interventions. But it's the case that, that this is not only true in humans, and there's an emerging literature, it's pretty new, looking at the importance of early adverse experiences in the development of behavioral disorders in dogs. And that these kinds of timelines that we see, this is an example of Macmillan published this, being born in a puppy mill, for example, and the risks of having a range of canine psychopathologies later in life really mirrors what we're seeing on the human side. And Annika Linde and myself, she's a veterinary cardiologist, we're working together on developing these kinds of parallels. But there are many, many interesting parallels in mental health vulnerabilities in humans and other animals. If we're only talking about dogs, it's interesting that just as obsessive compulsive disorder emerges often during human adolescence, canine compulsive disorder emerges most commonly during canine adolescence, and so on and so forth. I actually am going to end my, my talk right now by reading something to you, which is the, whoops, am I no longer sharing, I hope? Am I still sharing?
You've stopped sharing.
I have, so, all right. I want to just read something that, well, Catherine and I wrote years ago. It was actually a chapter on adolescence that we wrote in For's Ubiquity. So this is about a troubled adolescent. This adolescent seemed to be off on a bad course, bored and unmotivated. He was on the verge of academic collapse. His teachers bemoaned his lack of focus. They said he made no effort unless the topic personally interested him. To make matters worse, he preferred riskier pursuits like target shooting and drinking. And when he finally enrolled at university, drinking and smoking became his trademark among his peers. His father was in despair. Time after time, he tried to get his son to buckle down, to focus on school and on life beyond the age of 20. In one weak but memorable moment, his father said, "You will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. But don't worry." This young man didn't suffer too badly from his risk-taking, his rebelliousness, his refusal to accept the world as his elders taught and thought it should be. In fact, he parlayed his iconoclastic nature into one of the most storied careers in the history of science. Charles Darwin even later forgave his father's tough parenting, saying, "My father, who was the kindest man I ever knew and whose memory I love with all my heart, must have been angry when he used such words." So I think for all of us who've ever had a very bad fight with our teenagers, that can be a source of maybe some hope and inspiration. And I think it's nice also to just take a moment and think of the celebration of adolescence. That not only was Margaret Mead an adolescent when she got on, got on a ship and sailed to Samoa. Another adolescent who participated in an equally, if not more, influential transoceanic voyage was Charles Darwin, who was only 22 when he boarded the Beagle on the Davenport port in England. So adolescent, it's not all problems. There's a lot of creativity and lots that we can learn. So with that, I will be quiet and take questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Barb. That was fantastic. We are close to the top of the hour, but we're going to run over a little bit this time just to allow some opportunities for questions. There are quite a few in the chat box. Do we see any hands up, Meredith? Do you see any hands up?
We just had a hand go up, so we'll start with Joseph Graves. Joe, you can go ahead.
I hate to be the first one to be called upon, but one of the things I said in the chat, because I think you come up, Barbara, with a really interesting aspect of looking at social subordination and risk activity, or risk behavior. But one of the problems I've had, at least in the social science and behavioral science literature concerning risk activity, is a complete underappreciation of the way social subordination works in human societies. And part of it comes from the idea that the mainstream society is somehow legitimate, and the activities of people who go against that mainstream society, particularly groups called gangs, for example, are somehow illegitimate. And so what I talked about in the chat was looking at risk behavior in social contexts, and particularly which aspects of the subordinated individuals' lives are actually made safer by doing things that the majority or the dominant society thinks is bad, and which things are made riskier by doing what the dominant society says is good.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up. It's really very much on point. First of all, the Urban Institute, it's the report which I will send out, but you can find it. It's called Impossible Choices, and it was probably about 4 years ago or so. One of it's quite an elaborate study. I mean, it looked at a range of populations and looked at risk behavior in this context of poverty, in this context of simple, really desperation. And the point was that in communities that are already poorly resourced, that those are the adolescents who are at greatest risk, which, you know, on the one hand is not, not surprising, but I thought it was very interesting to kind of think about that comparatively. But to also, what was really compelling was to begin thinking about the ways in which we pathologize adolescents, and we pathologize some adolescents more than we pathologize others. And if you try to look at adolescence if you uncouple it from the context, you really go astray. So, for example, gangs you mentioned. I mean, it was interesting in this Impossible Choices piece. They do describe and they interview a number of adolescents who talk about just this, that the gang membership is really it's salvation. It is the norm. It is not considered risky. That not joining is considered riskier. And we're really talking. This is a piece about food insecurity. So we're really talking literally about sustenance. But what really spoke to me was that there's this sort of one-note way in which I think neurobiologists and frankly pediatricians and psychiatrists are explaining the science of adolescence, and that is with sort of brain science. Well, of course, the neurobiology. I mean, brain science can explain behavior. It has to, it has to be part of this explanation. But to see that, that the risk-taking that some adolescents are engaging in is directly linked, not to impulsivity at all, but to the opposite, to a kind of taking a look at the landscape and recognizing that the only resources possible happen to be these areas that happen to be risky. I thought that was sort of for me, it was a real light bulb in shifting how I thought about this. And by the way, why I think it's so important that we in the evolutionary medicine community really talk to people in the field to bring this kind of insight to them, because it's a mistake to think that all risk-taking is based on some impulsivity. There are these other social factors.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe a somewhat related question from the chat. Sonia Cavagelli had asked, is there evidence that particularly risky adolescents that survive development go on to be more successful adults? So in essence, are there opposite selection pressures at different life stages that allow high-risk individuals to persist?
Right, that's a great question and a really relevant question. And I want to make the point, which I should have, is that when we're looking at risk-taking, every single one of these studies needs to be considered in the context of the life history of that species. And in some cases, the life history of that species in a specific region. And so there are many, many specific differences. But to your point, probably the best answer comes from the work of Linda Fairbanks, whose work on vervet monkeys. She actually saw that the males who were the bigger risk takers, and in some cases kind of obnoxious, they actually had greater reproductive success. So she addressed that question directly. I'm sorry, Lynn Fairbanks, forgive me, Lynn Fairbanks, who worked with vervet monkeys. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Now we'll go back to raised hands. Melanie Martin is up next. Melanie, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating presentation and discussion. I wanted to ask about appreciating the perspective very much that the environment and potential resource scarcity in the environment can create behaviors favoring more risk-taking. But looking at humans, I'm also curious about how culturally biased our developmental conception of the prefrontal cortex is. So when we talk about it not being fully developed until age 25 or whatever it is, how much of that has to do with the environment and challenges that adolescents are put into? So if you live in an environment where you're given more responsibilities and challenges early on, does your prefrontal cortex develop more quickly? Do you have an earlier developmental trajectory then because of the, and not necessarily risk-taking challenges? It could be parenthood, it could be just the type of household care responsibilities that you're given, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked, because I had an opportunity to just interview so many fascinating, brilliant people, and one of them was Linda Spear, and we had a conversation. Linda, she studies development. She looks at adolescence. She looks at comparatively, but she was describing this precise sort of framework of looking at risk-taking in context and in animals, and to really kind of move away from having the adult as cooked and the adolescent as a precursor for, kind of to really to see that the adaptations during specific developmental periods are important for those developmental periods, and perhaps approximate the next proximate developmental period that we were in general looking too broadly. And one really kind of example, I think, of how we can be led astray if we are not, if again, our cultural window, if that aperture is narrow, we're gonna go astray. It has to do with, well, what are the risk curves? What are the mortality curves in parts of the world where you don't have guns the way we do, and you don't have so not as many adolescents are in cars, right? Co-highways. So if you look at the mortality for adolescents, most of that in the US, that CDC data, it's mostly car accidents, right? And but then we see suicide, and guns play a role in that, and so that is a question which I don't have satisfying data for, and I've looked for it. But I think it's important, and one way to sort of untangle the specific unique cultural influences on our culture's influences on these pretty startling mortality curves, and really beginning to see what's culture and what is our culture versus another culture. I will say that the comparative, these characteristics of adolescence that you see in fish in birds and in mice, for example, and in rodents, those are pretty consistent. This neophilia, this reduced threshold for risk-taking. Interestingly, the reduction of the threshold with conspecifics. I mean, that I had a conversation with Lawrence Steinberg. He's a brilliant. I mean, he's again one of the sort of founders of the science of modern science of adolescence. And we were discussing whether predator inspection, which is typically done with multiple individuals, and where we see the willingness of individuals to approach predators, something that would otherwise be very dangerous when there are multiple individuals together, whether we might be, again, as a hypothesis, looking at a shared mechanism or related mechanism with the reduced threshold for risk-taking that we see in human adolescents that's responsible for so much morbidity and mortality.
Great, thank you for that. So I think we have time for one final question. So we'll go to Ron Willis. Ron, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'd like to ask about eating disorders. Do wild animals get eating disorders? And what might be the evolutionary benefits of such a condition?
Yes, that's a great question. And I actually, one of the chapters in Ubiquity is on eating disorders, but in other species. And I teach quite a lot, more and more on this topic. So the wild versus non-wild question, I understand why it emerges, but consider for a moment that the neurobiology that underlies eating disorders is going to be present whether an animal is wild or captive or domestic or agricultural, and that captivity, perhaps the stresses of captivity, is going to be unmasking that essential vulnerability. So having said that, why might that vulnerability to, let's say, for example, anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa exist? Let's take first anorexia nervosa. So if we, and by the way, I'm saying this with lots of caveats that I'm not saying that that these are the same, that I'm not talking about anorexia nervosa in a fish. I'm giving you an example. I'm talking about a comparative perspective and a hypothesis about some potentially connected mechanisms. So consider this, that in human anorexia nervosa, there's body dysmorphia, right? So an individual looks in the mirror and perhaps thinks that he or she is heavier than they actually are. And they reduce their caloric intake to modify their body size. And having trained as a psychiatrist before I was a cardiologist, I worked on an adolescent unit, and I remember there was a big discussion in psychotherapy, which we used to do. We would talk about what individuals feared, what they were trying to control. And so that's an interesting perspective, that not eating as a way of controlling your environment, staying safe. So there is a species, there are several species, I have 4, but one I'll tell you about is the emerald goby. And the emerald goby lives, I think it's off the coast of Papua, but there's an interesting social dynamic. So there's a single dominant male in a group of gobies. I think it's 10 to 12 or so individuals. And there's a pretty linear hierarchy. It is a size-based hierarchy. When the subordinate starts to, so the subordinates are growing, when the subordinate reaches within 5 to 10% of the size of the dominant, the subordinate attracts the attention of the dominant, who otherwise is ignoring the subordinates, and starts to, it presumably perceives the subordinate as a threat and tries to push that individual outside of the school. And that's pretty much instant predatory death. And so what appears to be an adaptive response to this is that when subordinate fish reach within 5 to 10% of the size of the dominant, they suppress their eating. And there's the studies that looked at this did a really good job controlling for food availability, etc. But it appears to be an adaptive, the investigators used the word dieting. I would not ever have had the nerve to say that, but that's their word. An adaptive, voluntary, again, cessation of ingestion of calories that are there in order to remain safe, to control body size, in order to not, attract the attention of the dominant. So that's one example. The other example that I think is interesting has to do with regurgitation. So bulimia nervosa is an eating disorder in which there are periods of binging and purging. Folks who are suffering from bulimia who are purgers will say that they get, there's an anxiolytic benefit of both the binging and the purging. Now, why would the purging be anxiolytic? Well, again, there's a neurobiological explanation. But it's interesting that if we look at regurgitation in wild animals, we see a pretty wide range, at least in marine mammals and several species of birds, of vomiting, of emesis in response to fear. Vomiting can be used as an actual anti-predation strategy among some birds. Some vultures actually use what's called defensive regurgitation, presumably to sort of, it's a projectile vomiting that's sent into the eyes of a potential predator. It's acidic and I'm sure it doesn't smell very good. But it's interesting that fear-induced vomiting is fear-triggered vomiting is something that is seen across chordates. It seems to be sort of embedded in the autonomic neurophysiology of ingestion. And so when we think about that as vomiting as a fear-induced strategy, it's interesting to begin thinking about regurgitation. And there's a disorder among zoo animals called reingestion regurgitation, where they regurgitate repetitively and reingest the emesis. And that's part of a stress response to social stress. Again, I'm not drawing any direct lines, but I'm simply shining lights on studies that and species that we know to have some connected physiology, in order to really begin to tease out the elements of vulnerability that are proximate, that are triggered by events and are facilitated by the physiology of the individual, and on a more non-proximate point of view. That is the vulnerability based on how natural selection, evolutionary processes have shaped who we are as human beings.
Okay, couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you, Barb, for a wonderful presentation. That was really great, and I want to encourage everyone to go out and buy a copy of your book. I enjoyed it very much. And as well, we have a book review in Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. I posted that earlier in the chat. The preprint of it is now available on the website for the journal. I want to thank Meredith as well for all the help coordinating this and handling all the questions. You do a great job with that every time, Meredith. Thank you very much. And of course, I want to thank everyone for joining us. This was another fantastic group, big group, and lots of really interesting questions. So a lot of things we couldn't get to in this limited time period, but I hope you enjoyed the interaction with colleagues and hearing some new perspectives as well. For the next two of our Club EvMeds, we have our 14th of these. It's sort of hard to believe, but we're on number 14 for next week. We have Nina Jablonski, who's going to be speaking on the evolution of human skin color, what we know and how we can talk about it. That's going to be Monday, July 6th at noon Eastern Time. And then after that, on July 14th, we have Verena Schunemann from University of Zurich. And she's going to be talking, we don't have a title yet, but it's going to be on paleogenetics, and it's going to be a great talk. We have a few other people lined up for early August and September, and we'll inform you about those as the time gets closer. But we really hope to see you again next week, and sign up on our website, the Club EvMed website that I posted earlier in the chat, so you can stay informed about our events. Thank you, everyone. Thanks especially Barb.
Thank you.
Great to see everyone.